So if you would like to add a top stitching detail to any of your garments, you can do that by going over here to where it says, let's bring it up. Segment top stitching here. Okay, segment top stitching. The one above that is edit top stitching. So if anything has to be changed after you place it, that's the tool to use. So I'm going to begin by selecting my segment top stitching. And essentially what this does is if you select any of your seams, it will add top stitching to the inside of that seam. So for instance, if I wanted to add top stitching along my yoke where it connects to my skirt, and I wanted it only on the yoke section, I would select the lines that are seams, the segments, on the yoke section itself. Okay, and so if I go in very closely, I may not be able to see the top stitching yet because I need to have some parameters set that will help it become more visible. So again, I've selected segment top stitching and I've selected the two lines that are for my yoke. I can begin to see a line here, but that's not very obvious, okay? And so what I can do then is go into my object browser where it says default top stitch, double click on that to make sure it's pulled up in my property editor. And then there's some things we can change that would make this a little bit more visible. The first thing we can change is the offset. So this is always set to 1/16 of an inch, which is very, very close to the actual seam line. If you offset this by a little bit more, like 1/8 or 3/16, let's go 1/8. That's pretty standard for top stitching. That is a good thing to start with. For stitch count, this means how many lines of stitching there are. You can have 2 lines of stitching if you want to do a double top stitch, and you can see that it's already added that double top stitch there. When it's a double top stitch, you get a new menu where you can have the same specifications for each line, as well as the same material. Or if you toggle those on and off, it'll give you additional options. And you can see now when I have 2 in my stitch count, I have 2 tabs here that allow the specification to change or be different between those 2 top stitching lines. I'm going to go back to 1 because I only do want 1 line of top stitching, and you can see it got rid of the other one. So in addition to changing the offset to make it a little bit further away from your seam, you can also change the length or SPI of those stitches. That's stitches per inch. The smaller the number here, the larger the stitches will be. So I tend to go towards like an 8. It makes the stitches bigger, but maybe not any more visible until you add the space in between those stitches. So this is in inches. So you want a very small number. Okay, so if I put 0.1 and then hit enter, it gives a space in between my stitches. That actually is quite a large space, as it turns out. It makes it look like pick stitching, which is fine, but you can make it smaller still. So 0.03 or 0.02. Let's see how that works. Okay. And so I can start to see my stitches defining themselves here. But there's a few other things we can change to make it even more obvious. The thread thickness, which is in text, is always set at 40, but a larger number would make the thread thicker. So if I did 80, I hit OK, you can see that the threads look much bigger, and you can start to see them a little bit more clearly from a distance. Okay, you can have this be 120 even if you really felt like it, whatever you'd like. Makes it nice and thick, like top stitching thread. Okay, I might even change this to a 0.05 rather. And now I can really start to see that top stitching. Of course, the other thing you can change is the color. As long as it's a little bit different from your background fabric color, it'll make it slightly more obvious. So you don't have to do anything dramatic, but you can start to see that changing the color makes it more visible, especially when you're just looking at the garment in normal proportions. Okay. And so this is essentially placing that top stitching on my yoke because that's what I've selected. Now that I have changed the configurations of my top stitch, that's no longer really my default top stitch. It is, you can save it if you'd like to keep that one. If you would like to add a different top stitch, like a different color even, you can go into add, or you can copy it and then just change a couple of the parameters. If I'd like to add it to both my seam lines here on my yoke, I just simply select the other line there. And you can select all your lines if you prefer, front, back, and so on, to kind of give it the detail that you might want to see. Okay, even the side seams if you like. So one of the things that you can do then when you go into edit top stitching is select any of your top stitching and take a look at the property editor there. So for things like this, where this top stitching is overlapping, or if you have a curve, sometimes it's a little bit more obvious. The seam lines don't really behave always the same. They may cross or things like that where you're not expecting it. And when you get to that, you may see what at a corner, at a right angle, I'm going to have a different parameter here. I might smooth the curve when it gets to the corner as opposed to having it be kind of running off the edge. And you can see that when you look at that yourself. So again, the top stitching is pretty easy to add in. If you'd like to delete it, you don't want it there anymore, go back into your edit top stitching, select it, and then just delete it with your delete button. Okay, this was the reason I had to delete it twice was because this was a mirrored piece. I really only needed to add it once to my piece for it to work. Okay, so there you go. There's top stitching and edit top stitching.